Sometimes I look back at the person I was 6 months ago and I barely recognize her. She was naive. She thought the biggest problems in life were juggling work and school pickups, or whether to paint the kitchen gray or beige. Now, my reality is defined by hospital ceilings and the heavy, metallic tang of desperation. I need to tell you everything because Mark, my husband, he still doesn't know the full truth. And Eleanor, my mother-in-law, well, she's the reason I crossed a line I never thought possible. This isn't just a story about a bad mother-in-law, it's about what happens when your child's life hangs in the balance, and the only thing blocking the rescue is pure, venomous spite. Our son, Ethan, he's 5. He's all sunshine and muddy knees. He's the center of our universe, the living proof that Mark and I built something real and good. Everything was perfect until the exhaustion started. Not the normal tired of a kindergartner, but a deep, bone-weary fatigue that settled behind his eyes. He got pale, then bruised easily. When the pediatrician ordered blood work, I told Mark not to worry, that it was probably just anemia. I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong. The diagnosis came 2 weeks later. Aplastic anemia. It's rare, brutal, and terrifying. His bone marrow had stopped producing enough new blood cells. The doctor was gentle, but the words hit like a physical blow. He needs a bone marrow transplant. And he needs it fast. The next few weeks were a blur of testing. Mark and I were the first in line. We were tested, and we waited with a sickening knot in our stomachs, praying for a match. When the results came back, neither of us was a perfect match. A partial match, yes, but the chances of complications were too high. We needed perfection. The hospital team then moved on to immediate family. Mark's brother, David, and his parents, John and Eleanor. David and John were tested quickly. Both were partials. Then there was Eleanor. You need to understand my relationship with Eleanor. It was a Cold War, fought over dinner tables and holiday seating arrangements. She never liked me. I was too common, too loud, too much, everything she wasn't. She made my life a quiet misery, criticizing my parenting, my cooking, my career. But for Ethan, she always put on a performance. A grandmother who sent expensive gifts and posted sweet photos. I truly believed that if it came down to a life or death situation for her only grandchild, the performance would end and the genuine grandmother love would take over. The call came when I was sitting by Ethan's bedside, holding his tiny hand while he slept under a heavy sedation. It was Dr. Chen, the lead oncologist. "Mrs. Hayes, I have some news," she said, her voice cautiously optimistic. "We found a perfect 10 out of 10 match. It's Eleanor, Mark's mother. The relief that washed over me was so intense it almost made me faint. I cried right there, silent, grateful tears pooling on the sterile hospital sheets. I had pictured this moment, but I hadn't dared to believe it would happen. We had a chance. Ethan would live." I immediately called Mark, whose voice cracked with emotion when I told him. Then Mark called his mother. That's where the fairy tale ended and the real horror began. Eleanor didn't answer right away. When she finally called Mark back, I listened on speakerphone from the waiting area, leaning against a cold wall. "Mother, it's a miracle." "You're a perfect match for Ethan. The doctors want to schedule the procedure right away." Mark sounded ecstatic, breathless with hope. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that doesn't mean contemplation, but calculation. "Mark, dear, that's lovely news," Eleanor finally said, her voice smooth and chillingly indifferent. but I won't be doing it." Mark's face went blank. "What? What are you talking about? Mom, he's your grandson. He needs you." "I understand the seriousness, Mark," she said, sounding bored as if discussing a broken appliance, "but the procedure, the recovery, it's invasive. And I have my commitments. My trip to the Riviera is booked for next month, and frankly, I won't risk my health or my schedule for something I don't feel entirely comfortable with." I snatched the phone. "Eleanor, stop being ridiculous. This isn't a vacation inconvenience. This is your flesh and blood. He is dying. He needs you to donate bone marrow." "Don't shout at me, Sarah," she snapped, the mask finally slipping. "You always were hysterical. Besides, I told Mark years ago I do not like hospitals, and I certainly won't be submitting my body to needles and tests. It's my body, my choice." "This isn't about choice, Eleanor," I whispered, the hysteria rising in my throat. "It's about basic human decency. It's about being a grandmother." "I am a wonderful grandmother when it suits me," she countered. "But you know, Sarah, this is just karma. You always thought you were better than me. You thought you could come into my family and take my son. Now you need something from me, and the answer is no. Find another donor." And then she hung up. I stood in that empty waiting room, the receiver warm against my ear, listening to the dial tone. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt cold, absolute clarity. That woman, Mark's own mother, was willing to let her grandson die out of sheer petty malice towards me. Mark tried everything. He pleaded, he begged, he even threatened to cut her off entirely. Nothing worked. Eleanor was immovable. The doctors were frantic, but ethically and legally, they couldn't force her. A living donation is always voluntary. Ethan's condition worsened. He was back in the hospital, and every time I looked at his frail body, a new layer of panic settled over me. We were running out of time. The National Donor Registry search was slow, and every day was a risk. One sleepless night, staring at the sterile white ceiling tiles, an idea, a truly criminal, insane idea, formed in my mind. It started with a quiet observation. Eleanor was vain about her health. She constantly visited a high-end wellness clinic for anti-aging blood tests and vitamin infusions. They already had her DNA on file for genetic health mapping. She was also an extremely busy woman, always traveling, always delegating. If Eleanor wouldn't volunteer to save Ethan, I would find a way to make her legally obligated to do so. The only way the hospital could proceed without her explicit, renewed consent was if they had a court order based on a perfect match found in the registry, or if they believed the match was absolutely confirmed. I knew I couldn't tamper with the official hospital lab, but the private clinic? That was a weak link. If I could get a sample of her blood already on file at that clinic and swap the paperwork, making it appear that her old banked sample was the one that matched Ethan, I could present it as irrefutable evidence. It was insane, yes, but looking at my son hooked up to machines, I realized there was no line I wouldn't cross. I had to save him, and that meant dealing with Eleanor's past. The cold clarity I felt after Eleanor hung up on me didn't last long. It was quickly replaced by a hot, shaking mix of fear and nausea. I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the only path forward was a criminal act. But what did the law matter when my son was fading right in front of me? When human decency failed, extreme measures became the only currency. My plan revolved around the Oasis Wellness Clinic, Eleanor's temple of vanity. They specialized in personalized preventative medicine, which essentially meant they kept deep archives of their wealthy clients' genetic and blood profiles. They had Eleanor's history, her blood, and her ego, all neatly filed away. The clinic was exclusive, expensive, and crucially, very discreet. Their entire business model was built on never asking too many questions, which I hope translated to lax internal security when it came to record keeping. I spent the next 3 days doing things I never thought I'd do, staking out a building, learning the shift changes of the staff, and figuring out the internal naming conventions for laboratory samples. I wasn't some spy. I was just a desperate mother with a Mac laptop and too much time on her hands in a hospital waiting room. I discovered that Eleanor's former assistant, a young woman named Chloe, had been unceremoniously fired a few months prior for what Eleanor called gross inefficiency. Chloe had hated Eleanor with a passion that was almost as pure as Eleanor's malice towards me. I took a deep breath and sent Chloe a carefully worded email, offering a substantial sum of money for detailed historical billing information regarding Miss Eleanor Hayes's appointments at Oasis. I framed it as a legal battle, which, in a way, it was. Chloe called me immediately, not for the money, but for the chance to stick it to Eleanor. She didn't have access to the physical blood bank, but she had something better: the master security code for the back entrance used by third-party maintenance crews, and a detailed floor plan. More importantly, she told me about the clinic's internal auditing process. Once a month, all bank samples over a year old that weren't tied to an active, ongoing treatment plan were moved to a long-term, off-site storage facility. Eleanor's genetic mapping sample, taken 18 months ago, was scheduled for transfer next Tuesday. This was my window. I needed to replace one of Eleanor's banked blood vials with a vial of my own blood, labeled with a non-matching ID, and take her vial. But I couldn't just submit her blood to the main hospital lab and say, "Hey, test this." The hospital required consent forms. I needed the hospital to believe they found an anonymous donor who was a perfect match, an anonymous donor whose DNA just happened to be Eleanor's. I waited until the early hours of Tuesday morning. My heart was a frantic hummingbird inside my chest. I drove Mark's old, unmemorable sedan to the alley behind the Oasis clinic. Using Chloe's code, the heavy steel door clicked open. The air inside smelled faintly of expensive cleaning products and something metallic. The lab area was terrifyingly pristine. I found the cryogenic storage unit clearly marked for samples awaiting transfer. It was locked, but the lock was a simple electronic keypad, the kind Chloe had predicted would be reset to a default 1111 by the maintenance team that was scheduled to come in later that day. It worked. Inside, the racks were labeled with alphanumeric IDs, not names. I had learned Eleanor's ID from Chloe's billing notes, EH0810G. There it was, a small glass vial labeled and frozen. I swapped it with a carefully prepared vial of my own non-matching blood, making sure the label was smudged just enough to look like a handling accident, but not enough to render the ID unreadable. A non-match would eventually be found, but by then it would be too late. Ethan would have his transplant. I got out as quietly as I went in. The second I was back in the car, I felt the intense urge to throw up. I had committed burglary and fraud, but I had Eleanor's DNA in my possession. I waited until the next day. I needed to act fast. I found a highly recommended independent lab in a different state. one that offered fast-track genetic testing for international donor registries, and fabricated a story about receiving a mystery vial from a deceased relative's estate overseas. I paid a premium for rushed, anonymous testing. The results, confirming a 10 out of 10 match, came back 2 days later. I anonymously shipped the results, the lab report and the remaining sample, to Dr. Chen at the hospital, including a brief typed note saying the donor wished to remain completely anonymous but was willing to proceed with the donation process under a special expedited court agreement. When Dr. Chen called me, her voice was shaking with relief. "Sarah, you won't believe this. We got an anonymous submission, a perfect match, 10 out of 10, identical to the match we had before. It's like a miracle. The only issue is the legal hurdle, but they've agreed to the court-ordered PHS, Public Health Service, protocol, since the match is so strong and time is of the essence." I sank into a chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thank God," I managed, my voice thick with feigned exhaustion and genuine relief. I knew someone out there had to be an angel. The hospital filed the emergency court motion immediately. The judge, seeing the critical condition of a 5-year-old and the irrefutable genetic match, bypassed the need for the living donor's physical consent to proceed with the preliminary procedures, citing the extraordinary circumstances. They scheduled the first round of mobilization shots for the donor for the following week. Everything was moving so fast. We had a date. Ethan was going to make it. Then, the world crashed back down. Eleanor was back from her short, pointless trip to the Hamptons. She was at the hospital, striding into Ethan's room like a furious storm cloud, Mark trailing helplessly behind her. "What is this nonsense I'm hearing, Sarah?" Eleanor's voice was low, vibrating with suppressed rage, which was far scarier than her usual hysterics. "A court order? A donor? They just called me from the hospital's legal department, asking me to confirm my availability for a mandatory pre-procedure screening because of some anonymous match. Do you think I'm stupid?" I kept my gaze steady on Ethan, who was sleeping peacefully. "I don't know what you're talking about, Eleanor." "They found a match. That's all that matters." "Don't lie to me," she hissed, leaning close enough for me to smell her expensive perfume. "That anonymous match has my DNA. Only my DNA. The hospital doesn't just pull genetic profiles out of thin air. They needed a sample, Sarah. Where did they get that sample from? You did this." I was silent, which was all the confirmation she needed. "That's illegal," she spat. "That's identity theft. I will have you arrested. I will have this entire procedure stopped. You cannot force me to give my body to your dying child just because you feel entitled." Mark finally stepped forward, his face pale and confused. "Wait, Mother, what are you saying?" "You're a match? And you're saying Sarah? Did something illegal?" Eleanor ignored Mark, her eyes locked on mine, venomous and absolute. "You pathetic little thief. You thought you could defeat me? I will personally go to the judge and tell him you forged the evidence. I will make sure Ethan never gets the marrow and you rot in a cell. You just committed professional suicide, Sarah, and you also just killed your son. Because now I will not only refuse, I will fight this donation until the court realizes this entire process is based on a fraudulent sample. It's over." Eleanor's words didn't just hang in the air. They crystallized, hard and sharp. "You just committed professional suicide, Sarah, and you also just killed your son." The venom in her eyes was proof that she meant every single word. She was willing to prioritize her spite and her vanity over the life of her own grandson. Mark stood between us, his head swiveling, trying to make sense of the collision between his frantic hope and his mother's furious accusation. "Mother, you need to calm down." "What evidence? What are you talking about? Sarah, tell me what she means." I looked at my husband, the man I loved, the man whose weakness had always been his mother. He was demanding the truth, but I knew the truth would destroy him and potentially destroy Ethan's last chance. "She's lying, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the lie tasting like ash. "She's desperate to stop this because she can't stand the thought of being inconvenienced. She's making up stories. They found an anonymous match, Mark. That's what matters." Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "Oh, you sweet, simple boy. Of course she's lying." Sarah broke into the Oasis clinic, stole my banked blood sample, and submitted it to the hospital as an anonymous donor. I have the clinic security report confirming a breach in the cryo vault. The evidence is solid. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant. He didn't need to ask the question. My silence confirmed it. His entire body sagged. "Sarah, is that true?" he whispered, and it wasn't an accusation. It was the sound of a heart breaking. "He is dying, Mark," I finally snapped, tears of pure rage burning my cheeks. "You heard her." She refused. She would rather go to the Hamptons than spend 2 days in recovery. She was going to let her grandson die. What was I supposed to do, Mark? Sit back and wait for the donor registry to fail? I did what you were too afraid to do. I fought for our son. Eleanor smiled, a cruel, triumphant twist of her lips. "See, Mark? She admits it. You chose a criminal, and now you'll watch her pay the price." With that, she dramatically swept out of the room, presumably heading straight for the hospital's legal department. The next 48 hours were a legal nightmare. Eleanor filed an immediate injunction to stop the preparatory mobilization shots, claiming the entire process was based on fraudulent evidence obtained through theft and identity manipulation. The hospital was thrown into chaos. Dr. Chen and her team were devastated, trying desperately to find a loophole while the legal teams battled it out. Meanwhile, Mark and I were locked in a cold silence that was far worse than any shouting match. He couldn't look at me. He was caught between the woman who saved his son and the mother who had always controlled him. "Why couldn't you have just waited?" he asked one evening, his back to me, staring out the hospital window at the indifferent city skyline. "Wait for what, Mark? For the funeral arrangements? We had a match, a perfect match, and she, your mother, chose spite. If you had stood up to her in the first place, none of this would be happening. It's the law, Sarah. I can't live with a person who commits a felony. You can't live with me? Try living without Ethan. That's the choice I was faced with." We were on the verge of divorce, screaming at each other while our son lay unconscious only a few feet away. The pressure was unbearable, a crushing weight of legal jeopardy and medical urgency. The court hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. Eleanor was ready to testify, armed with the clinic's security footage of the breach and her lawyer. I was prepared to take the stand and confess everything, hoping a sympathetic judge would look at the motive, saving a child, and grant a medical exception. The night before the hearing, Mark came into the small waiting room where I was trying to sleep on a vinyl couch. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. He sat down heavily and took my hand. "I went to see my mother this afternoon," he said, his voice flat. My blood ran cold. "What did she say? Did you convince her?" He shook his head slowly. No, she just reiterated her demands. She wants you to plead guilty to the theft. She wants full custody of Ethan, and she wants me to file for divorce. That's her price for allowing the transplant to proceed without a legal fight. It was exactly the monstrous demand I expected. I laughed, a bitter, dry sound. She can burn in hell. I'll go to prison before I give her our son. Mark tightened his grip on my hand, his knuckles white. I know. But Sarah, there's something else. Something I need to tell you before tomorrow. Something that changes everything. I braced myself. Was he leaving me right then? He took a deep, shuddering breath. When I heard you were a match, I went to my mother's house. I was furious. I demanded she do it. We had a huge fight. That night, she said something. She said, "You're always so eager to defend her son." I asked her what she meant. She kept saying I should look at the files, that I never look at the files. Mark's eyes were distant, filled with a terrible realization. I remembered the boxes in the attic. My dad passed away 3 years ago, and we never really went through his old office. He was a retired geneticist, you know. He kept meticulous records. Mark paused, fighting for control. I spent all day yesterday in the attic, Sarah. I found a locked safe. Inside were my father's journals and a file folder labeled EH Final Analysis. EH is Eleanor Hayes. My chest tightened. I knew what was coming before he even said it. The first hospital test, the one that found Eleanor was a perfect match for Ethan, that test was correct. But my father's notes explained why. Years ago, before we were married, my mother developed a rare autoimmune disorder. She needed blood components, and my father secretly banked her full genetic profile just in case. But his notes, they weren't about her disorder. He finally looked at me, and the pain in his eyes was unbearable. Sarah, my father's notes confirm that Eleanor is not my biological mother. She's my aunt. Her sister, who died shortly after giving birth, was my real mother. My father, who was Eleanor's husband, adopted me and raised me, and they maintained the lie to protect the family's social standing. The secret twin from my father's affair, I stared at him, unable to speak, the world spinning. Eleanor wasn't his mother. She was his aunt? And that's not the worst part, Sarah. I also found the paperwork from the original tests they ran on me and my brother David years ago when we were kids. They ran them out of curiosity. The notes clearly state that David is my half-brother, sharing only my father's DNA. Which means, Mark's voice broke entirely, which means, he whispered, his eyes filling with self-loathing, Eleanor isn't related to Ethan at all. She is related to me genetically as a maternal aunt, and my real mother, her sister, was the perfect match's source. But if she's not my mother, and David is only my half-brother, he trailed off, pulling a wrinkled yellowed paper from his pocket, an old private DNA report. Look at this, Sarah. This is the paper. The note reads, Subject DH, David Hayes, is only 50% matched to Subject JH, John Hayes, our father. Subject MH Mark Hayes is 50% matched to JH and 50% matched to another unknown maternal source. But the biggest secret of all, the one she has been protecting for decades. David is not Eleanor's son either. He looked up at me, his eyes full of anguish. The second perfect match test, the one you submitted, it wasn't just her DNA, it was my real mother's DNA. The DNA she stole and banked years ago. And what if this perfect match, this life-saving match, is actually coming from a place neither of us ever suspected? The air in the sterile hospital room wasn't just heavy with fear, it was now thick with decades of deceit. Eleanor wasn't Mark's mother. She was his aunt. The DNA I had illegally retrieved from the clinic, the DNA that was the perfect match, didn't just belong to Eleanor. It belonged to Mark's deceased biological mother, banked and stolen by Eleanor years ago for her own medical paranoia. "What are you saying, Mark?" I managed, my mind reeling. "If Eleanor isn't related to Ethan and the match is perfect, then who is the match really?" Mark slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. "My father's notes were cryptic, Sarah. They referenced a sister complex and a secondary source. He was tracking two women, his wife Eleanor and her twin sister, my real mother, Clara. Clara died in childbirth. My father and Eleanor fabricated the story of Clara being the black sheep, disowned, and they raised me as Eleanor's son." I looked down at the old DNA report Mark was holding. "The document says David is only half-matched to your father, and you're half-matched to your father and an unknown source. It also says David is not Eleanor's son either. Who is David's mother?" Mark shook his head, looking utterly defeated. "I don't know, but the key is the DNA you submitted. It's Clara's, my biological mother's. But Clara died 5 years before Ethan was even conceived. How can her DNA be a match now?" Suddenly, a cold, terrible possibility struck me, making my stomach churn. "Mark, listen to me. Your father was a geneticist. When he banked Clara's DNA, the perfect match, he did it because she had the genetic predisposition for his autoimmune issues. That means the match is familial, it's shared. The match isn't coming from a dead woman, Mark. It's coming from someone alive who shares that exact, unique genetic marker with Clara." "Who?" he asked, his voice raw. "Think, Mark. Who else in the family carries the same unique genetic signature as your biological mother, Clara, that Eleanor would desperately try to control or suppress? Who else did Eleanor exclude from the original testing, knowing the risks?" My eyes landed on the old DNA report, specifically the cryptic line about David not being Eleanor's son. Wait a minute. David is your half-brother, sharing only your father. If Eleanor wasn't his mother, who was? And why would she lie about that, too? Mark's face went pale as he followed my logic. We were staring at the answer, hidden in plain sight. Eleanor had two massive secrets to protect, the fact that Mark wasn't her son and the identity of David's true mother. "The only person Eleanor hated and feared more than me," I whispered, "was the one who held the key to her entire life's lie." Mark slowly picked up his phone. The court hearing was hours away and he knew he had to act. He called his brother, David. It took 20 frantic minutes for Mark to convince David to meet us immediately at the hospital lobby, not giving him any details, just the frantic urgency of Ethan's life. When David arrived, looking rumpled and confused, Mark thrust the old DNA report and his father's journal notes into David's hands. He then laid out the full, shocking story. Eleanor's refusal, my desperate forgery, the injunction, and the discovery of Clara, Mark's biological mother. David read the documents, his face morphing from confusion to sheer agonizing comprehension. He looked at Mark, then at me. "She's not my mother," David asked, his voice barely audible. "Eleanor, she lied about everything?" "Yes, David," Mark said, his voice heavy with guilt. "She kept us apart. She manipulated us both. But we need to know who your mother is, David. Because the match for Ethan, the perfect match comes from a genetic line that Eleanor has been trying to erase for decades." David looked down at his father's journal again, specifically at the entry about his own paternity. He finally noticed a marginal notation, almost invisible, next to the line about his mother. LV, confidential, 1985. LV, David mumbled. I remember that. When I was a kid, a small photo fell out of Dad's wallet. It was a beautiful woman, dark hair. He snatched it back and told me never to mention it. Her name on the back was Laura Vance. Laura Vance, I repeated, reaching for my phone. A quick search revealed an older social media profile. The woman in the picture was striking, bearing a faint, undeniable resemblance to Mark's deceased real mother, Clara. But the crucial detail was in her bio. She was a retired nurse who had worked in the hospital system where Mark's father, the geneticist, had worked, and she was listed as having one surviving relative. The breakthrough hit me like a physical wave. Eleanor's jealousy of Laura Vance, the nurse who clearly had an affair with her husband John, Mark and David's father, and who was David's biological mother, suddenly made horrifying sense. Eleanor didn't just hate me. She hated any woman who threatened her fabricated life. But why was this important to Ethan? Mark, the match isn't David and it wasn't Eleanor, I whispered. The realization almost too perfect, too devastating. It was Clara, your deceased mother. And the notes say she was genetically unique, carrying a rare but perfect marker for Ethan's condition. The person who shares that perfect marker isn't David's mother, Laura Vance. It's the person who shared the most DNA with Clara, the one who Eleanor has been ruthlessly controlling, the one who is closest to the source. David was the only one who didn't fully grasp it. So, who is it? Mark and I exchanged a horrified look. The truth was so audacious, so twisted that it had to be right. Eleanor had to protect this person, because exposing them would unravel her entire life. Mark, I said, my voice shaking, we need to retest the original sample from the hospital. The one that came back 10 out of 10 perfect match. We need to test it against David's DNA, not just Eleanor's. If David is only your half-brother and Eleanor is only your aunt, the match must be stronger than that. It must be a full sibling, a hidden sibling. Mark looked at the old file again, his father's final analysis. He traced the lines of text about the maternal unknown source. Then his eyes widened, staring past me at the hallway. The day before my father died, he asked Eleanor to bring him the twin, Mark said, his voice a guttural sound. I thought he was delirious. But Eleanor panicked. She slammed the door and wouldn't let anyone near him. The twin, I breathed. Clara had a twin. That's why the DNA was so perfect. Not Eleanor, but her twin sister, who they pretended died, but actually gave Mark life, was the original match source. And the second twin, the one Eleanor was tracking. We stared at David. He was the one who was constantly overlooked, belittled, and tested separately in his childhood, but he wasn't the donor. David's mother was Laura Vance, the nurse. Who was the other twin? Mark took the initiative. He called the Oasis Clinic, pretending to be his father's estate executor, citing the old files. He demanded to know who else had the EH0810G genetic profile flagged in their system as a mandatory cross-reference. The clinic manager, terrified of Mark's sudden, authoritative tone, finally cracked. Sir, the only other profile flagged to that unique marker, based on Mrs. Hayes' specific security protocol, is the profile of her daughter, your sister. Ms. Charlotte Hayes. Eleanor insisted that Charlotte's health profile be constantly monitored against her own. My heart hammered against my ribs. Charlotte, Mark's sweet, quiet younger sister who had disappeared years ago after a nervous breakdown caused by Eleanor's constant control. "Mark," I choked out. "Charlotte. She's the perfect match. She's the twin sister of your real mother, Clara. She's the one Eleanor has been holding hostage with her lies. We have to find her." The revelation that the perfect bone marrow donor was Mark's younger sister, Charlotte, who Eleanor had emotionally tormented into disappearance years ago, was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Eleanor hadn't just refused to donate, she had actively hidden the true living match to maintain her decades-long network of lies. Mark's face was a mask of cold fury. The timid man who had always bent to his mother's will was gone, replaced by a desperate, betrayed father. He immediately hung up with the clinic manager and started furiously texting Charlotte's old burner phone number, the one she used to occasionally check in with David. "We have to find her now, Sarah," Mark insisted, his voice a low growl. "The hearing is in 3 hours. If we don't have Charlotte there, Eleanor will win the injunction, and they'll suspend all pre-transplant preparation for Ethan." I was already dialing Dr. Chen's private line. "Doctor, listen to me. The donor is Mark's sister, Charlotte Hayes, not Eleanor. Charlotte is the actual blood relative of the source DNA. Eleanor has her medical records flagged to hers because Charlotte is the true twin of Mark's deceased birth mother, Clara. Eleanor banked Clara's DNA and has been tracking Charlotte's profile against it. You need to tell the hospital lawyers that the genetic match is Charlotte Hayes, not the woman filing the injunction." Dr. Chen was skeptical, but professional. "Sarah, we can't just change the donor name on a court filing without a physical sample and consent." "You have the physical sample," I shot back. "It's the one I sent anonymously." "Test that sample against Charlotte's old records. You'll see the match. We are bringing Charlotte to the courthouse, but you need to delay that hearing by at least an hour." Dr. Chen agreed to try, saying the revelation of Eleanor's complex fraud might be enough for a judicial delay. We had bought ourselves an hour. Mark's phone buzzed. It was Charlotte. She'd been living under the radar in a tiny, quiet town miles away, working as a librarian. Mark, choking back tears, told her everything in rapid fire. Ethan's critical condition, Eleanor's refusal, the DNA forgery, the discovery of their true family history, and the shocking news that she was Ethan's last best hope. Charlotte was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She lied about everything. About me, about Mark, about my father. "Please, Charlotte," Mark pleaded. "Ethan is dying. You are the only one who can save him. If you refuse, I swear Eleanor will destroy us all with this legal battle, and Ethan will pay the price." There was another, longer pause. Then, firming her voice, she said, "Tell me where the courthouse is." "I'm driving." We sped to the courthouse, the old DNA reports and Mark's father's journals clutched in my lap, my evidence against Eleanor's malicious injunction. David stayed behind with Ethan, promising to update us minute by minute. We arrived just as the judge, Justice Hawthorne, was about to reconvene. Eleanor was already there, poised and icy in a designer suit, her lawyer standing smugly beside her. Mark and I looked like we'd been dragged through a hedge backward. Eleanor caught my eye, a flicker of satisfied malice in her gaze, confident that she had cornered us. Mark's entry, however, threw her off guard. He strode directly to his lawyer, pulling him aside, urgently showing him the documents. The hearing began. Eleanor's lawyer presented their case. The anonymous donation was obtained through the criminal theft of Mrs. Hayes's DNA, rendering the entire court-ordered procedure invalid. They demanded an immediate permanent halt to the transplant preparation and the prosecution of the person responsible, me. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was it. Just as the judge was about to speak, the courtroom doors burst open. Charlotte walked in, her face pale but resolute. She walked straight to the defense table and laid her hand on Mark's shoulder. Eleanor gasped, her composure instantly shattering. "Charlotte, what are you doing here? You should be home." Charlotte ignored her eyes fixed on the judge. Mark's lawyer, having seen the new evidence, immediately requested a temporary recess. Justice Hawthorne, sensing the high drama, granted a 15-minute break. In the crowded hallway, the final confrontation exploded. Eleanor grabbed Charlotte's arm. "You foolish girl! You think you can ruin my life. You will not step foot in that courtroom. I will cut you off, just like I cut off your pathetic mother." Mark stepped between them. "Eleanor, stop. It's over. We know everything. You're not my mother. You're my aunt. Clara was my mother, and Charlotte is Clara's twin, not your daughter. And we know David's mother is Laura Vance. Your husband cheated on you, and you built your entire life on a mountain of lies." Eleanor's face went slack, then twisted into a terrifying snarl. "That's a lie, a desperate ploy to steal my money and my grandchild. I raised you, Mark. I sacrificed everything." Charlotte, quiet for years, finally spoke, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "You stole my life, Eleanor. You controlled every breath I took, and now you're trying to kill my nephew. I'm the match, Eleanor. I am the 10 out of 10 perfect donor. You flagged my profile because you knew I was the one, the genetic twin of the deceased mother you hated. You were keeping me on reserve." Eleanor stood there, defeated, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. When the court reconvened, Charlotte took the stand. She submitted a statement confirming that she was willingly offering herself as the donor. Mark's lawyer then dropped the real bomb, presenting the documents proving Eleanor's true identity, the fraudulent adoption, and her long-standing medical deception. The judge, Justice Hawthorne, listened gravely. He ruled that while my actions, the forgery, were illegal, the context of medical necessity and the subsequent uncovering of massive familial fraud by the plaintiff, Eleanor, were mitigating factors. He immediately dismissed Eleanor's injunction, ordering her to pay the court costs. Furthermore, he granted an expedited court order for Charlotte to proceed as the living donor. The case against me was referred to the district attorney, but with a note recommending extreme leniency due to the compelling circumstances. I was safe. Ethan was saved. 2 days later, Charlotte was wheeled out of the operating room, slightly pale but smiling weakly. The procedure was a success. Ethan's new bone marrow was already engrafting. He was going to live. As for Eleanor, her life collapsed. Mark filed for a legal separation and subsequently divorce, citing emotional abuse and fraudulent marriage. He and David, finally free of her control, established a tentative but healing relationship with Laura Vance and Charlotte. Eleanor, stripped of her authority and her social standing, sold her mansion and retreated from public life, her poisonous influence finally neutralized. Mark and I didn't get a perfect storybook ending. The trust was irreparably damaged by his lifetime of denial and my act of desperation. We had saved our son, but we couldn't save our marriage. We divorced quietly a year later, prioritizing co-parenting and Ethan's happiness. but I never regretted it. I risked everything, my marriage, my freedom, and my reputation, to save my child from a cruel, manipulative woman and a family secret that almost destroyed him. And in the end, I walked away with the only thing that truly mattered: my son, alive, healthy, and finally free.